Hi everyone. Welcome to the first ever edition of Hack's broadcast news program, Rural Update. It may also be the last, so enjoy it while you can. Hi, I'm Lance George, and I can imagine what you're thinking. This is what they brought? I know, I don't have anchor height, or anchor hair, or anchor looks, and I certainly don't have an anchor's voice. And the makeup department here at WHAC really can't do much with this. But what I do know is that we have the best research and information team in rural America, and we give you news that you can use, not just on today's program, but every day, to help you inform sound strategies and solutions for your community. Before we start, it's obvious there's a whole lot going on out there in rural America. I mean, we've got a seemingly never-ending and divisive pandemic, an uneven and tumultuous labor market, and housing. Where do we even start? Price increases at all-time highs, limited inventory, millions in tenuous housing situations, which really means eviction or foreclosure, and supply chain headaches, building material shortages, and on and on. The question you may be asking, are these issues different, better, or worse in rural America? And more importantly, how are these issues affecting you? We're going to try and answer some of those questions on today's show, so stick around. For a lead story, a topic everyone is tired of, no one wants to talk about, but still an influential and important part of our collective and individual lives. No, we're not talking about the end of Britney Spears' conservatorship or who should be the next Jeopardy host. Unfortunately, we're still talking about COVID-19 and what it means for rural America. Since February 20th, 2020, there have been over 7 million reported cases of COVID-19 in rural America and another 120,000 associated deaths from the disease. COVID-19's impact on rural America continues to evolve. The most recent Delta variant reminded us that while the economic and housing impacts from the virus are important, the health component of this crisis is still primary and continues to dictate how communities will ultimately recover and react. Still, economic housing conditions are inevitably impacted by the virus. COVID-19 has and will continue to impact almost all sectors of the rural housing market. For more on rural America's new normal, we turn to Hack's Christina Davila.
Thanks, Lance. The pandemic has changed how many people do their jobs, and those working at rural housing organizations are no exception. Thomas Ryan from Housing America Corporation in Somerton, Arizona, shared how his organization has adapted. First, they reduced staff's hours temporarily and started working remotely. They transitioned to using video conferencing to provide pre-purchase counseling, homebuyer education, and loan packaging. Their self-help crews reduced their sizes to accommodate safe distancing. They wore masks and disinfected common work areas and equipment. A year into the pandemic, they reopened their office hours with continued safety protocols. Then they had to deal with recalculating loan amounts, negotiating down prices for lumber and other supplies, and facing the uncertainty of appraisals. Their latest challenge has been figuring out how to deal with back-ordered supplies, such as windows and air conditioning units, due to supply chain issues. Ryan expressed optimism about the organization's ability to face other impacts of the pandemic, saying, "We are not certain what other consequences of the pandemic we will encounter next, but we are certain to adapt." You can learn more about how the pandemic has affected rural housing from practitioners and experts in our latest issue of Rural Voices magazine, at Hack's website, ruralhome.org.
Thanks, Christina. And as Christina mentioned, check out Rural Voices magazine. This is a supersized edition. I don't know how many print magazines there are today, but you can still get Rural Voices in good old-fashioned glossy paper, or maybe the easier way to do is check out ruralhome.org. It's always a great read, and this special edition of COVID and the new normal provides a wealth of interesting and useful information. Hack also regularly presents data and analysis on COVID-19 and how it's impacting rural communities. You can access that regular reporting on COVID at ruralhome.org. In other top news, the U.S. Census Bureau recently released new population figures from the much-anticipated 2020 census. The Census Bureau estimates a total U.S. population of 331 million residents. The decennial count indicated a 7% increase in the U.S. population over the last decade. Population for rural communities was particularly anemic, though. The Housing Assistance Council estimates that the total rural population only increased by roughly 164,000 residents, or 0.3% over the last decade. Overall, 60.5 million people live in rural America. Suburban and exurban areas continue to experience the largest population growth, and this continues a trend of increasing suburbanization that has been consistent over the past few decades. While population growth was generally small for rural areas, that varies by what community you live in. For more on this story, we turn to our special correspondent, Dr. Keith Wiley.
Over the last 4 years, stories about rural America have focused on its troubles. Headlines like "Most of America's rural areas are doomed to decline" and "The hard truths to save the rural economy" detail the challenges many rural areas face, essentially leaving one with the impression of rural America as universally shrinking and aging, with few prospects for future growth. While Census 2020 data does show limited population growth for rural areas in aggregate, actually less than 1%, the picture is far from one of universal gloom and doom and decline. While yes, 2/3 of outside metropolitan area or rural counties did experience population decline over the last decade, that means a third, or 654 rural counties, had population growth. And of these 654 counties, 90 had a growth rate of 10% or more. While not the norm, these are far from rare occurrences. Virginia's rural communities provide an excellent example of this. While 79% of Virginia's rural counties actually did experience population decline over the last decade, 1 in 5, or about 21%, had a population growth. And of these counties, one of them is right behind me, Louisa County. Louisa County is home, along with Spotsylvania County, to the largest freshwater lake in Virginia, and Louisa County is also the fastest growing rural county in the state. Louisa County's population has grown for 6 straight decades since 1960, and it's also doubled since 1980. It's twice as large today. Louisa County's population growth rate over the last decade was 13%, which is almost twice the national rate of 7%. Located within the Washington, D.C. and Richmond metropolitan areas, essentially at the exurban fringe, and containing high amenities and being a recreation and retirement destination, Louisa County has many of the attributes that it takes to be successful, but it also does serve as an example that rural communities can be successful, even in such difficult times. This is just another nuance that's often missed in the national narrative about rural America. Back to you, Lance.
Thanks, Keith. Looks like a beautiful day there in Central Virginia. As a reminder, you can learn more about rural population change nationally and in your community from research and resources produced by the Housing Assistance Council. You can access these reports and data at ruralhome.org. In other news from Census 2020, the Census Bureau also released figures on our nation's racial and ethnic composition. Overall, the census data signal an increasingly diverse nation. But what about rural America, which is often considered less diverse? HAC's Natasha Moody reports on what the data say about racial and ethnic composition and change in rural communities.
Thank you, Lance. The country is in fact the most diverse it has ever been. White non-Hispanic is the most prevalent race ethnic group across the country, making up 58% of the population in 2020. Hispanic is the second most prevalent race ethnic group, making up 19% of the population. Rural America, although increasingly diverse, is 75% white, not Hispanic, a 5% decrease from 2010. The second most prevalent race ethnic group is Hispanic at 10%. There are many communities in rural America where the most prevalent race ethnic group is white non-Hispanic, but there are communities in rural America which differ from that trend, like Hendry County, Florida. Hendry County's most prevalent race ethnic population is Hispanic per the 2020 census data. Big Cypress Reservation, one of the 6 reservations of the Seminole Tribe of Florida, is located within this county. Rural America is racially and ethnically diverse. There were population increases in rural America across Native American, Hispanic, Asian, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander populations from 2010 to 2020. There were population decreases in Black, non-Hispanic, and white non-Hispanic populations in rural America from 2010 to 2020. The largest population change across USA and rural America was seen in multiracial populations, with a 148% increase from 2010 to 2020. The data gives a snapshot and overview of residents' race and ethnic identities across rural America. However, these numbers do not represent their stories, histories, and experiences. Due to the nation's history of systemic exclusion of various race ethnic groups from the housing market, it's important to understand the implications of these systems as we move forward towards racial equity in the housing market and safe, adequate, affordable housing for all. Reporting from the Florida station, Natasha Moody signing off. Back to you, Lance.
Thanks, Natasha. It's December here now. Maybe you can help me get posted to the Florida Bureau. What's that? When Florida freezes over, huh? Well, in the interim, you can learn more about Natasha's reporting and actual research on race and ethnicity in rural America by visiting www.ruralhome.org. And now, a word from our sponsor.
Is information overload getting in the way of doing your job in affordable rural housing? Appropriations, regulations, reconciliation, rehabilitation, best practices, equity, climate change, loans, grants, USDA, RD, RHS, HUD, CDFI, TDHE, PHA, HFA, FHFA, FMHA. Stop! Take a breath. We have what you need. We have the Hack News. Just the facts. Your source for everything you need to know about rural housing and rural America, dropped quietly into your inbox every 2 weeks. For 50 years, we've brought you information about funding opportunities, national program and policy updates, findings from recent research reports, and much more. The Hack News. Information on rural housing and rural America.
The Hack News, folks. Every 2 weeks since 1972. This is the original edition in 1972. Doesn't come in paper like this anymore, but if you're not receiving it in your inbox, make sure you subscribe. One of the things we've learned from the past 18 months or so is that renters have been particularly impacted by the pandemic. Renters tend to have lower incomes, less wealth and savings, fewer housing protections, and more were likely to have their jobs impacted by the pandemic. Even before the crisis, there was a dearth of good quality rental housing in many rural communities. And as we'll hear from our award-winning Mike Feinberg, the availability of quality rental housing in some rural communities is declining at an alarming rate.
USDA's Section 515 Rural Rental Housing Program is an important source of affordable housing for rural America, but a significant number of these rental homes are leaving the program.
Since 1963, Section 515 loans financed nearly 28,000 rental properties containing over 533,000 affordable units. Very few new properties have been financed since 2012. Many properties were built before the late 1980s. The loans on these properties are reaching mortgage maturity or the final installment on the loan. When the USDA loan is paid off, the property is no longer eligible for rental assistance or other program benefits. Section 515 properties can be found in about 86% of all U.S. counties. As of July 2021, there were 12,742 properties containing 395,000 units in the program. Between April 2016 and July 2021, 928 properties left the USDA portfolio. Many of these properties are in Midwestern states. White non-Hispanic tenants were the most affected as Midwestern states saw the most property losses. A number of owners paid off their mortgages between 2016 and 2018. USDA worked with them to extend the term of the loan to keep some of the properties in the program. This explains the decline and subsequent increase in property numbers reported in the USDA data.
Additional information is available on HAC's website. Thank you.
Now that many of us can work from wherever we want, we're all getting away from the traffic and bustle and moving to bucolic rural America, right? Well, we continue to hear the stories of the Bozeman boom and rural locales that have been swamped by city slickers working in the Zoom economy. But the story is probably a little more nuanced. Keith Wiley took a look at some housing data to give us a clearer picture.
The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically altered everyone's life over this last year and a half. For many, these changes involved where they worked and indirectly where they lived. For millions, suddenly one day, their place of work shifted from an office space to their home. And in response, people changed where they lived, either permanently or temporarily, to other areas, and at least anecdotally, many of these were outside metropolitan or rural communities. And this has caused some to ask whether working from home can have a transformative effect on rural communities. A review of the most recent Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data provides a little bit of insight and a glimpse into the at least initial impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on rural housing markets. And the data does show that there was an increase in home purchase lending in rural areas. There was an increase of 13% in rural areas of home purchase lending in 2020 over 2019 levels. And this was greater than the rate of increase in compared to suburban and urban areas. The year-to-year change in rural areas in home purchase lending was twice as great in 2020 as it was in 2019. And 3/4 of outside metropolitan area counties or rural counties experienced an increase in home purchase lending in 2020 over 2019 levels. Many areas did increase and see a growth in lending, but this was not necessarily distributed evenly across counties. Recreation or retirement destination, or essentially high amenity counties, which make up about 25% of rural counties, received about 47% of the lending. And this is not necessarily surprising because these communities would be their high amenity areas that are in regular times often receive a large share of the lending and would be sought out by people working from home. But it should also not necessarily diminish the fact that overall majority of rural communities did see a growth and likely some benefit to their housing markets. But only time will tell the impact, whether this continues and the degree to which it will continue and the number of communities that will be impacted. But there is likely something here, at least in the short term, that would certainly impact rural housing markets, and it's important to look at. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. As many of you know, Dr. Wiley is our chief data guru at the Housing Assistance Council, and he's all the time producing maps and data, but they're not bulky like this. Most of them are interactive and easily accessible at ruralhome.org or our data platform, the Rural Data Portal. Jim Barksdale, a former CEO at Netscape, once said, "If we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine." We've had a lot of data presented here today, but I'm going to go with my opinion for a moment. This brief presentation by HAC's research team was intended to do a few things, really. Provide some meaningful data and information about recent trends and issues that impact rural America, and most importantly, the people of rural America. Secondarily, we also wanted to provide a little levity at the end of a 3-day virtual conference and not just another dry research presentation. But finally, at a tertiary but possibly more important level, you've heard me say on multiple occasions that at HAC, we hope our research, data, and information provision will ultimately help you, the consumers of these products, develop strategies, solutions, and policies for your communities. Obviously not within this 15-minute segment, but with our past 50 years of research and hopefully long into the future. Increasingly, I think we need to add to that triumvirate of strategies, solutions, and policies. And personally, I think a fourth element might just be values. I'm not talking about values in the moral and maybe traditional sense, but in a way that quality research and information can also convey a sense of value in the meaningfulness of our work for the people of rural America. I don't want to delve into yet another worn debate or polemic on the seemingly increasingly divide between our nation's rural communities and suburban and urban areas. But like many of you, I am from rural America. And I know that I often internalize an existential crisis both personally and professionally on this divide. In a perfect world, data would inform research that would then contribute to sound information that would enhance those strategies, policies, and solutions. But the values of feeling respected and included in creating your own destiny matter. that you matter, that someone is not trying to tell you how to live your rural life or your community's worth from the halls of a think tank or from an office building in Washington, D.C. And I don't want to confuse the issue either. Myself and everyone at HACC have an unyielding commitment to the highest quality scholarship, commitment, and relevance in our research. We do not subscribe to ignorance or backwardness that have insidiously crept into our national and political debates, akin to consuming information with blinders on. I do believe that well-researched and thought-out policies, along with deeply committed community-based people and organizations like yourselves, are the best hope for rural America, as well as bridging some of our corrosive divide. But sometimes policies don't always resonate with those who they're trying to help or intended to help. In that drawn-out formula schematic of data, research, information, strategies, policies, solutions, we also need to think about values that resonate with the people and places that we have all committed to, and do astounding work every day to improve. Daniel Keyes Moran, a computer programmer and science fiction writer, said, "You can't have data without information, but you can't have information without data." I would add to Mr. Moran's line of thought that you can't have strategies, policies, and solutions without values as well. Thank you. All right, folks, we're out of here. If you learned one thing from today's show, it's to go to www.ruralhome.org to access more data, research, and information on your community. And from rural America, that's the way it is.